Hello everyone, Stjepan here. I'll continue the series on Bobby Fischer, or Robert James Fischer, which is his full name, with a video from the candidates tournament held in former Yugoslavia in Bled, Zagreb and Belgrade. The first part of the tournament was held in Bled, Slovenia, then it moved to Zagreb, Croatia, and then to Belgrade, what is today in Serbia. And 6 very strong players were playing the tournament, and the winner would contend Mikhail Botvinnik for the World Championship title in 1960. In the end, Mikhail Tal won the tournament with 20 out of 28, 20 points out of 28 games, which is an amazing score considering how strong the field was. And even that at that time, a draw was a common result in such a strong tournament. So having 20 out of 28 is amazing. Paul Keres came in second with 18.5, 1.5 points less than Mikhail Tal. Tigran Petrosyan was third with 15.5, Vasilis Mislov was fourth with 15, Bobby Fischer came in only fifth with 12.5, so not such a good performance, but you have to remember that he was 16 in 1959 and trying to compete with Paul Keres and Mikhail Tal and all the other Russian superstars who have been playing top-level chess for the last 20 years is a bit unexpectable for young Bobby, but as we all know, he will become much better than them soon after this. Behind Bobby were Gligoric, Olafsson and Benko. Gligoric was the best Yugoslavian grandmaster, Olafsson was Icelandic, and Benko was an American. So a very strong field, and of course Mikhail Tal was expected to win, and he was the strongest of all. He won the Zurich tournament of 1959, just a few months before this event, and he also won the interzonal tournament in Portorož the year before that, where Bobby actually qualified for this game. And in this game, this was round 1 of the candidates, Bobby was playing Paul Keres, and Paul Keres is an Estonian grandmaster. He played, of course, for the Soviet Union because Estonia was in the Soviet Union at the time, and he's by far the strongest Estonian athlete of all time. He's actually on the banknote 5 kroner, Estonian kroner, which they used before they implemented the euro, of course. And he is a legend of Estonian chess. He was almost the world champion on 5 occasions. That's why he got nicknamed Paul II, or the Eternal Prince of Chess. So a bit unlucky there, but he's one of the rare people who won a game against 9 consecutive world champions. So throughout the whole 20th century, he actually played active chess, and he died in 75 or 76, I'm not sure. So a very strong player and one of the greatest grandmasters of all time, definitely. And by the way, another thing, Tigran Petrosyan is now the second chess player who is on a banknote. Armenia implemented him on their banknotes just recently, as a side note. And of course, Bobby was 16 in this game, and starting the tournament well would mean a lot to him, and especially because he was a kid at 16 who came to Europe probably alone. I don't think his mother went with him. At this point, I'm sure she already moved to California, so he was living alone in New York. And it must have been hard psychologically, no matter how strong he was or how much experience he already gained playing international tournaments. So a very hard game and a beginning of a very strong tournament, and by far the most important in Bobby's life so far. Paul Keres was white. He played pawn to e4. And Bobby played the Sicilian defense. Of course, he played a lot of stuff, and against d4 you could probably expect the King's Indian from him, but against e4 he would go for e5, c5, sometimes even the Caro-Kann, and a lot of different stuff. But the Sicilian is very fighting, and perhaps he wanted to make a statement in round 1 at the start of the tournament. So c5, knight to f3, d6, the open Sicilian, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6. These are all the main moves. And now after knight to c3, a6 by Bobby, he goes for the Najdorf Sicilian. And this is even today the most popular variation of the open Sicilian, and it has so much theory that even some lines from the 60s and from the 50s are still played today. And there is so much new theory coming out, being discovered yearly since the engines arrived, that it's so heavily analyzed. I think Maxim Vachier-Legrave is currently the biggest expert on the Najdorf, so if you're interested in that, study his games. Here, Paul Keres plays bishop to g5 on move 6, which is slightly uncommon. It's the third most common move. By far the most common after a6 is bishop to e3, and The other options are bishop to e2, bishop to c4, developing to a more active square, going to f3 instead of developing, or going for h3. And these are all very common moves on move 6 for white. So black, if he plays a6, then he has to know a whole bunch of theory and at least 6 or 7 theoretical moves, highly theoretical moves on move 6 for white. But Paul Keres after a6 went for bishop to g5, and there is nothing wrong with that. This is actually the main line of the Najdorf and the line which was most commonly played at that time in the 50s and in the 60s. Fischer now plays the most common move, e6, we have f4, and the point of this variation is that black has of course played a6 to prevent the knights from coming to b5, but it's also a double purpose move, and it's preparing to play b5 swiftly and strike with b4 and open up white's queen side, and white is doing the same thing on the king side, striking at black's king. And it's similar in a way to some dragon positions, because the side that manages to attack faster will usually win, and there's no time to lose, every tempo matters. In this position, after f4 by white, Bobby didn't go for the most common move, and there is a theoretical line which goes about 25 moves in depth. I'd like to show it to you just briefly, which starts with queen to b6 by black. This is by far the most popular move, and the line goes queen to d2, sacrificing the b2 pawn, and after queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen to a3. I'll just swiftly go through the moves. This is not what happened in the game, I just wanted to show you the most common variation. So in this line, black gets 2 pawns in the end, actually, and black is supposed to be slightly better, but the position is still played, and a lot of strong grandmasters played it even recently. And there's a game, Anand Lukvanvili, which was played just a few years ago. Anand had white here. So it's a theoretical line in which both sides stand okay. As you can see, white is sacrificing a lot of material, but he has great initiative for the pawns. But back to the game. After f4, so Bobby didn't go for this line, perhaps thinking that Paul Keres would expect that, and it was the most common continuation. Bobby played bishop to e7, which of course is not bad. It just gives white a slightly bigger advantage than if he went for queen to b6. After bishop to e7, now queen to f3 by Paul Keres, queen to c7, both sides develop, white castles queen side, knight b to d7, and here Paul Keres makes a mistake. Not a mistake, but a slightly imprecise move, and you actually don't have time to lose in this position, and white should attack as soon as possible. He should strike at black's king and start a pawn avalanche. So this is still theory, by the way, and the most common move, and perhaps the only played move in this position, is g4. And white needs to start opening up black's king side, and in order to do that, he has to push with g4, f5, h4, h5, etc. And black would respond with b5, we would have bishop takes f6, knight takes g5, g5, knight to d7, f5, opening up the position, bishop takes pawn with check. This is still theory, sacrificing a pawn. King to b1, because the king wants to be on b1 anyway, so giving up a tempo. So giving up a pawn to do that with tempo is actually okay. Knight to e5, queen to h5, and you can see that the position is very much double-edged, and white gave up a pawn, but he's actually better in this position. So g4 is the main move and the most active move. Instead of that, after knight b to d7, Paul Keres played bishop to e2, and this move is very slow. It gives black too much time in the attack on the queen side, and Bobby immediately starts attacking. He plays b5, the most active move, and after b5, black has actually equalized, or perhaps stands a bit better. And now bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, e5, bishop to b7, and this position is now the starting point of what characterized this game, and that's the fact that Paul Keres gave up his queen, surely thinking that he was better in that position, but it was a miscalculation. In this position, of course, after e5, just retreating the knight would be okay for black, but bishop to b7 just gains the tempo on the queen, and Bobby was surely expecting a move such as queen to g3, and after the queen moves, he would move the knight, sacrifice the g-pawn, etc. So what Paul Keres should have played was queen to g3, and after queen to g3, d takes c5, f takes c5, knight to d7, probably bishop to f3, challenging the bishop, or queen takes. So it doesn't really matter. But after this, black would castle, and the position would be normal. I mean, Black would still have a slight advantage because he allowed bishop to b7, and because white allowed bishop to b7 and played bishop to e2, which was far too passive. But white would be okay. So queen to g3 was the move, and even after d takes e5, f takes e5, and knight to d7, there was a way for white to fight for an advantage, practically speaking, with bishop takes b5, sacrificing a piece, because after a takes b, knight takes, now queen to c5, he has to save the queen. He could play queen takes g7, first grabbing a pawn and gaining a tempo on the rook, and after rook to f8, knight to d6 check. And after bishop takes e takes, you can see that white has a lot of threats in this position, a checkmate on e7 being the most important one. So white would be some material down, but you can see that black's position isn't ideal. The engines like black here, but practically speaking, it's hard to defend. So I think I'd rather have white in this position. But after bishop to b7, Paul Keres didn't play queen to g3, he sacrificed his queen with e takes f6. And this isn't immediately losing, it gives black a slight advantage, but Paul Keres actually misplayed the position afterwards as well. Of course, in this position, Bobby took the queen, there's no other moves. And now after bishop takes f3, he didn't move the rook, that would have been a mistake, but bishop takes f6. And after bishop takes f6, bishop takes a8. This is now the second key position of the game, in which Bobby realized that he can trap the bishop. So that's the theme in this position. You can see that the bishop, after it took on a8, it doesn't really have that many squares. It only has b7 and c6 if black pushes d5 and closes down the diagonal. So Bobby played d5 immediately, closing down the bishop, but there was a much better move actually. He should have played queen to c4, double attacking the knight and the bishop with d5 indirectly, and after knight to e4 he should have played either queen takes a2 or d5 now, attacking the knight, and after castles he would have another extra tempo. But after d5, white can actually save the position, and he can sacrifice the bishop for a couple of pawns and some initiative with bishop takes d5, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, and now e takes d5, knight takes d5. And you can see that black now has the queen for rook, knight, and pawn, which is materially completely equal, and the position is now materially, but even strategically equal, and both sides have chances here. And you could argue that white is perhaps even slightly better because he has a safer king and he has two rooks for the queen, which are actually okay, and the knight is for now at least better than the rook on ah, so on h8. So Paul Keres got through the worst of it, and Bobby made a mistake with d5. But after queen to c5, of course the queen was attacked, rook to e1 check, king to f8, c3 solidifying the position, and h5 making some room for the rook. Black is now once again slightly better, and now Bobby found a way to activate his rook in a very fast way. And after f5, which is an inaccuracy, rook to h6, now you can see that black has solidified and activated his last piece, and now of course the queen and rook are better than two rooks and the knight. So the game continues with f6, sacrificing a pawn, but he can't really do much. And Paul Keres found a great attacking plan in this position. Practically speaking, it gave him great chances, but Bobby was too good to allow any mischief happening from that plan. After g takes f6, knight to f4, h4, rook to d8 check, king to g7, rook e to e8. You can see that Paul Keres' idea is to checkmate here with the rooks. And that is actually really scary, but Bobby found a way to untangle from this position and to get an almost crushing advantage, an insurmountable advantage for black. First of all, queen to g1 check, king to d2, queen to f2, and now note that in this position, if the king, say, goes to d1, black can capture the knight, and it's not that this is checkmate. You have to remember that, because after queen takes f4, if rook to g8 check, then king to h7, and white will still have to check with the g rook on h8. So after rook h8 check, the king would have time to escape. So this isn't actually checkmate. So white can't sacrifice the knight. Because of that, after king to f2, Paul Keres covered the check with the knight. And after this, rook to g6, just solidifying everything. Now if white ever checks from g8, then king h6, king g5, and this is it. g3 by Paul, f5, giving the king even more squares to escape. rook to g8 check, king to f6, and now Paul Keres exchanges rooks, perhaps arguing that he could fight for a draw, but I think it's really hard in this position. And after rook takes, f takes, g takes, queen takes h2, he actually should have taken the h4 pawn, but it's a minor difference, and well, black is winning anyway. Now rook to d4, and I think you can see that fighting is pretty hard in this position for white, and the queen is much better than the rook and the knight. Of course, it's possible to draw if black plays too passively, but Bobby Fischer was too strong at 16 for that to ever happen. Now, queen to h1, king to c2, trying to get the king to some more safety, king to e5, activating in the center, a4, queen to f1, knight to c1, queen to g2 check, king to b3, and you can see that the white king is making some progress visually, but practically that really doesn't do anything, and black achieved something, and that's the fact that Bobby's pawns can now march forward freely, and the pieces were actually protected by the king when the king was on d3, I'm sorry, so the king moving away will make it harder for white to stop black's pawns. That's why black's advantage is increasing. Now b takes a4 check, king to a3, of course if king takes then queen takes on b2, queen to c2, knight to d3 check, king to f6, knight to c5, attacking the a pawn now twice or 3 times, queen to c1, now rook takes a4, and in this position the pawns are equal, and of course materially it's only 1 point advantage for black, but the queen is much better than the rook and knight combined. So queen to e3, knight takes a6, f4, the pawns are marching forward, and it's obvious now that white will have to give up a piece to stop the f pawn. Rook to d4, king to f5, the king is coming forward to help her the pawn to queening, knight to b4, queen to e7, pinning the knight to the king, king to b3, queen takes h4, now 2 pawns each, knight to d3, and the knight is actually prepared to sacrifice itself because Paul Keres has realized that there is no other way to stop the pawn. Now after g5, c4, queen to g3, c5, f3, and king to c4, white is prepared to sacrifice the knight. After f2, knight takes f2, he had to do that, queen takes f2, c6, and Paul Keres is pretending that his pawn is also strong, but it really isn't. And now queen takes b2, grabbing another pawn, king to c5, queen to c3 check, king to d5, g4, advancing the pawn, rook to c4, and he actually missed a mate in 1, which is surprising for Paul Keres, but Bobby now plays queen to e5, this is checkmate. The king has no squares, and it's remarkable that Bobby managed to win with checkmate in round 1 of the candidates against Paul II Keres, who was a much stronger player than Bobby at the time, and Paul Keres was actually feared in '59. He was one of the best Soviet players, and a remarkable victory by Bobby. Unfortunately, he didn't get to play as well throughout the tournament, and he only got 12 and a half. And of course, Mikhail Tal won. He qualified to fight Mikhail Botvinnik for the world title in 1960, and he actually won. He had 12 and a half points. Mikhail Botvinnik only had 8.5, so Mikhail Tal took over the title, but only a year later Botvinnik got it back. But that's a different story, and I will cover that in the series of videos about Tal and Botvinnik, which is coming up in a few months. But anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you got something from this crushing Sicilian Najdorf by the young 16-year-old Bobby Fischer, and stay tuned for more chess. Thanks very much, bye.